Hey everyone, my name's Taylor Kitchen and welcome back to Above the Yellow Line, the show where we do motorsports media your way, talking about NASCAR all the time. And this is a very special episode of Above the Yellow Line. I am so glad to be joined by a person that I've looked up to for years in this sport. She has paved the way for so many women in motorsports. She's worked in this industry for over 30 years as a decorated journalist, author. She is a cancer warrior and survivor. And today she is joining me to talk about her career in her brand new book, NASCAR Mavericks, co-authored by Branham, that is out already, so make sure to get your copy. But I am so pleased to welcome Holly Cain to the show. So without further ado, let's dive in. Well, Holly, thanks so much for joining me on Above the Yellow Line today. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on. I'm really excited about this.
Of course, I will say, I've looked up to you for such a long time, just as another female reporter trying to work her way into the sport. So I'm so excited to talk to you today. I know it's a busy week for you with NASCAR Mavericks getting released this week. You just came back from Phoenix. So I'm really excited to talk about your journey and just going from the beginning. We've been covering the sport for over 30 years. You're highly decorated, have several awards. You're an author. Where did this all start for you within the motorsports world? Where did it all begin?
First of all, I want to say thank you. You are extremely kind. And I'm really excited to speak to someone like you, who I see as kind of this next generation of women and motorsports reporters and making a real difference in the world. So thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. And you know what? In a way, I guess that kind of goes when I started 34 years ago in the business. There were not a lot of women, so like I said, it's really great to see you. I always wanted to be a journalist. In fairness, my father was a broadcaster, so I kind of had that. My mom was an English teacher, so I kind of had the writing, and I see my father on television, so I kind of had that in my background. But my entire life, I wanted to. I wrote for every newspaper I could, whether it was elementary, middle school, high school, college, and really just loved doing it, and was very fortunate to be able to get a job with the Tampa paper, which is local to where I live, and began my career that way. But I will tell you, motorsports was not the very first thing I covered. I had to be, I would say, pretty good at all with knowledge of all the sports. And so I started doing a little bit of this and that, whatever they need, whether it was football, baseball, track and field, college sports, high school sports, as well as starting with motorsports. But where I live in Central Florida is very close to Sebring International Raceway. So that's where all of this began for me, was going out to Sebring and covering the 12 hours of Sebring.
Do you remember the first race you covered? Like, what was that like for you?
I completely remember it. And I will say, the thing that stood out to me was how nice everyone was. Like, they were genuinely happy to help you tell the stories of them. And it didn't matter if they were, back then it was the IMSA Camel series, and GTP cars were the big thing, which are basically how it has evolved now again. But all of the drivers, no matter what classification they were racing in, were just so kind and wonderful. And I absolutely remember it. It was the March 17th was the date, and Derek Daly won the race, and he's Irish. So I always thought that worked out well. That was a story that kind of landed in my lap. But it really, and I'm sure you've noticed this in the motorsports world, I think I really feel, and having covered all these other sports, I can tell you, they're really some of the most genuine people that love to share their stories, and there's some great stories to tell.
Absolutely. I think just from college, and I wrote a lot when I was in high school, middle school. When you're covering stories, it felt like motorsports it came easier to me. I don't know if when you started covering motorsports and those stories, not only were the people kind of just felt more open, but did you feel like motorsports and the stories that came from that came more naturally to you as you were covering them?
As I went along, and you've probably experienced this, motorsports is such a broad category. So there's, IMSA, sports, which is the sports cars. There's NASCAR, there's IndyCar, there's all sorts of, there's drag racing, and motorcycles. So really, it also became about learning about each of the different genres within the motorsports world. And every time I went to a different race, again, here in Central Florida, we have the Rolex 24 Daytona, which is IMSA, the 12 Hours of Sebring, that's IMSA. We have the IndyCar Series open in St. Petersburg. And we also have drag racing in Gainesville. And we have, of course, the Daytona 500 with NASCAR. So being exposed to all of these big, and you know what, these are big time races too. So it was, kind of being thrown in the fire to a certain extent. But you're right. The people make the difference. And to this day, 34 years later, it's the people that make the difference.
Mhm. The people definitely make the difference, and I feel like you said, everyone's so welcoming, and when I was walking into the sport kind of for the first time in 2016, I felt like I had a community that was behind me, I had a community I could talk to, and everyone just felt kind of like your friend right off the bat. I know kind of when I walked into the sport is a little different than when you walked into the sport, but as a woman trying to cover this sport and being in the garage area, was that tough for you when you first started this 34 years ago, or what challenges did you have to overcome?
To a certain extent, it was. First of all, the general sports reporting background, there still were not a whole lot of women, and specifically on the print side, working for a newspaper. So I had kind of gotten used to maybe a couple of second glances or, how much do you know? I feel like I had to know and have great background, maybe more so than some of my male counterparts, because I was going to be tested on it. They were going to make sure that I knew what I was
Oh, yeah.
talking about. And so I definitely felt that. But you know what? It forced me to always be better prepared. And so that was something that I had to learn, and I was grateful for. But, there are other women sports writers that I've met before, and I dealt with this a little bit, but even going in the locker room, as all of the reporters do after a game, that was something to get used to for me and also for the players, very uncomfortable at times. And that was one of the things, if I were to be completely honest with you, that I enjoyed about racing was I didn't have to have a locker room. You could talk to them. And even this weekend, I was noticing it covering the championship 4 race for NASCAR out in Phoenix. We have such tremendous access to them in racing that I literally was standing next to Ryan Blaney as he climbed out of his car after just coming 3/10 of a second away from winning his second consecutive NASCAR Cup Series championship. The access that we have, and I feel like it also is something that you have to recognize, be appreciative of, and treat with the way it should be. In other words, I'm not going to run up to him the second he climbed out of that car. He clearly needed a few moments. He was disappointed. The same with William Byron and Tyler Reddick, and who were the other 3 competitors racing for the championship this weekend. So I think a lot of it is being able to read people, and also to have a certain amount of compassion in what you're doing. And that also transfers, whether it's, going up and asking the field goal kicker what happened if he missed an extra point that would have won the game, or a field goal, in overtime. The same thing with a baseball player, maybe that struck out in the bottom of the ninth with the bases loaded, that stood to give his team a chance to come back and win. So a lot of it is understanding compassion, and I don't know, kind of putting myself in, how would I feel if I were there?
Yeah, I think the one thing I've learned, just in the short amount of time I've been doing this, is the compassion piece of it. Being able to read people, giving the drivers, any athlete, just a second to breathe after they get out of the car, after they remove themselves from
Exactly.
the court. It's important to have that compassion piece.
Absolutely. And I think that they recognize that too. I actually noticed it when I was in Phoenix. A couple of people were kind of shoving their microphone in people's faces, and I could watch the drivers visibly stand back, like, just give me a second here,
Yeah.
And I don't think that made them as excited and eager to answer the questions coming from those reporters, if I were to be real honest. But it really is learning how to read people to a certain extent, and they recognize that. The athletes recognize that, especially over a period of time.
And through your career covering the sport, I'm sure the way you've covered it, or the way you've seen the sport covered, is very different. Like you said, the media is so eager to get the microphone in the face, get the story. Everything goes viral on social media now. It's so different. And I feel like too, this season in my view, and I want to get your perspective on this, has felt different with how we've covered it. I don't know after leaving Phoenix if you kind of had that same thought process on how this season's been different story wise, maybe coverage wise. But what's your perspective?
Well, it is. And you bring up a fantastic point. Not only are we covering it different because we have social media, so we can snap photographs and get it out on the second, or we can get a quote and get that out right away. Whereas when I started 30 years ago, the newspaper didn't come out till the next morning, right? So that's what you had to wait on. The other thing that I've noticed, particularly this year, starting to happen a little bit last year, is that in the case of auto racing, the drivers put their own message out. They might have podcasts in the middle of the week, and that's where you're going to really get the beefy information. They may not want to share that with you right when they get out. So I think that the different way that the integral athletes themselves can get the information out, whether it be from their team or, like I said, doing a podcast, or even just tweeting after a race, doing something on social media, they can control that now versus having to have their message and being very dependent on whoever that reporter was to report things fairly and objectively and frankly, honestly.
hmm I with that too, do you feel it's been, I don't want to say harder or easier to find stories now that the drivers are able to put out their own narrative, but do you feel like your head's a bit more on a swivel now than it used to be, now that you have all these different outlets you have to look at to kind of finish a story, put a bow tie on the weekend?
Absolutely. That is the case. And, but here's the thing that I also have noticed. Obviously, you want to kind of keep up, with their social media to see what they're saying, to follow things that they have decided is important enough to them that they want to talk about it. But also sometimes it's just catching the little things, like Justin Allgaier won the NASCAR Xfinity Series championship this weekend, and he sat on the stage. At that point, it had been almost 2 hours after the race before he came in to take a more formal question and answer. And he casually mentioned that he was having shoulder surgery. Well, I hadn't seen that. I don't know how many people knew that. And it wasn't from anything in a race car. He said it was from throwing the softball with his daughter, who's a competitive softball player. So sometimes you get those kind of things. You just have to really listen and observe. I think that's the key to it. And that's another thing that the reporters, and I see a slight tendency of this, unfortunately, the reporter isn't the story. We're the conduit to tell the story. So you need to listen. You need to pay attention to what the subject or whoever you're writing about or whatever situation you're writing about, that's the story. We're the reporters, we're telling it. I don't believe that we should be as much of the story as sometimes I see that happening.
It's almost like, I mean, we are supposed to be the messengers. It's what we're trained to do. We tell the story, we highlight the people, and it goes back to what you said is compassion and listening. And I kind of want to shift focus real quick to this weekend and what this meant for you. I hope it's okay that we kind of talk about the reflection you had this weekend at Phoenix. I know a year ago at Phoenix, you thought that maybe your cancer had returned, and unfortunately it did. You announced that earlier this year, and you went through chemo, and then luckily you announced in June that you were cancer free and you're recovering. And first off, we are so glad that you are here. We are glad to see that
Thank
you are
you.
healthy, recovering, of course. And just what was it like reflecting this weekend on that and just this whole journey?
I really appreciate you asking that. It was very emotional in the midst of such a big weekend. I always try to keep the personal away from the professional, but in this case, I did want to take a couple of minutes because the second time I had stage 3 cancer, it was a big deal, and so I took a couple minutes. But I will also tell you that a fellow reporter had mentioned it on social media, and I cannot tell you how many people were so kind to me, both on social media, but also in the garage area, drivers, team owners, crew chiefs, just people really care. And again, I think that's something really special in the motorsports world, and certainly in NASCAR. I really noticed that and took that in and felt very, very blessed, which is hard to say for someone that's gone through the cancer that I have. But I do. I feel very blessed, and it was really, really kind of people to notice and to encourage me on. I'm very, very lucky.
It goes back to the family aspect of this sport into just did you feel like this weekend was a bit of a celebration for you of just kind of seeing, how far you've come and just celebrating your health?
I was smiling all weekend. I was just so grateful. And yes, you're 100% right. When went through chemotherapy and months of radiation again, and I still suffer from some side effects greatly. But just being able to look back and in a way feel like I did it. And one of the drivers brought up to me, he's like, you know what? You are as tough as we are. You know what you have to go through, and keep your mind focused on getting through it. It's the same thing that they have to do when they're competing. So I mean, obviously it's not exactly, but I understood what he was saying, and it meant a lot to me that he looked at it that way.
I mean, it takes someone with so much resilience and just drive to beat something as tough as cancer, and that's definitely attributes that you have is that drive and that want. And so, again, we are so happy that you're still here, that you have defeated this cancer, and that you were able to really celebrate that at Phoenix.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that.
Of course. It kind of leads into just one, not only talking about just how you've been a trailblazer in this sport and how you've been resilient in your career, resilient in your health, going into this book about NASCAR Mavericks, talking about those that have been game changers in the sport, and everything in between. This comes out on November 12th, and I will tell you, I'm getting it day one. I'm so excited to read this.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Like, I heard you talking about this at Darlington, with Chad Knaus, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, like, this is, like, the coolest thing ever." Like, how did this idea start? Like, where do you even begin when writing a book like this?
Well, I have to say, it started with my co author. His name is Herb Branham. And Herb and I worked together at the Tampa Tribune. So that's how far we go back. All 34 years of my career, I have known Herb. And in fact, he was the first person I worked with at my first 12 hours of Sebring. So
Oh, wow.
we go back as far as you possibly can professionally. So he actually is the co author and had the book and came to me and said, I think I've got something really great here. Would you like to contribute to this, and let's work on this together? And so I was very grateful to Herb, and he is so good at coming up with strong ideas and approaches to those. And the great thing about this book, I feel like, is that it's a coffee table book. The photographs are absolutely amazing, and all of the stories are told in like 2, maybe 3 pages. So you can have it sitting out there. And it's divided up. The chapters are done by decades. So you might want to just check out something in the 1940s and then jump to something in the 1980s. You might want to read up about the Wood brothers and what they did and how they pitted at Indianapolis 500 as well as their famous NASCAR tenure. Or you might want to go straight to Ross Chastain riding the wall at Martinsville a year ago, right? In the playoffs. So that's what I really like about this book. And I think that you don't have to be the hardest core NASCAR fan. I think it's just an interesting book. And that's what we try to do, is tell stories that you hadn't necessarily heard before.
Speaking of that, I don't want you to give too much away, but was there a story that you heard or, wrote about when writing this book that you were surprised by, something that caught you completely off guard?
You know, I will say that for me, it was a great history lesson. And I think learning about some of the things in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and how they went about racing before I was on the beat all the time, obviously, was absolutely amazing. And if you think about how Bill France Sr. created the sport, it really is as trailblazing, pioneering, and amazing as it could possibly be. And I don't mean to keep harping on this, but I found a lot of the stories about the women very interesting. And you know what? I absolutely know that Bill France and Herb Branham, the co-author, had written biographies on both Bill France Sr. and Bill France Jr., both of them not with us now. But he knew and had great stories to tell. But in each of these cases, women played huge roles, whether it was someone they might have hired as a secretary that went on to run the finances. Their wives played huge roles. Lisa France Kennedy, who is still very, running NASCAR, she continues to play a huge role. I saw her over the weekend, and she's someone I greatly admire for what she's done for the sport. So, and not to mention the women that competed early on. We think about Danica Patrick, who did so much and brought attention back, and has been so great, and other women that continue to blaze through this sport. But think about how difficult it was in the 1950s and 60s for them to do it. Think about, Janet Guthrie racing. She has a tremendous story to tell. So I learned a little bit from it all, and I'll tell you, I was very intrigued by what Herb had to write. I did more of the, I would say, 70s, 80s, 90s, present day work. But I think the early days, people will find something interesting too.
Over the years, how have you seen through your research the trailblazers and the Mavericks of the sport change? Do you feel like either they're taking more risks now than they were? Like, how have you seen them change over time?
I would say different risk. And you brought up Chad Knaus, who was kind enough to sit with Herb and I and talk about the book. I just saw him over the weekend. And the thing about Chad, he's always got a smile on his face. You always think, what are you up to? And I also saw Tony Stewart over the weekend. And I think about some of the things that they did, and they were willing to push it. And these are modern day competitors. And, speaking to them, and we have like Smokey Eunuch in the book. I think that the Mavericks are people that said, why not? Why not challenge this? Why not push it? Let's keep going for success. Just because it was done one way before doesn't mean we can't try and achieve the same success in another way. And I feel like, in some ways, as we've discussed, that's kind of been my career. So I can really appreciate the Maverick. But in NASCAR specifically, I feel like the Mavericks are really the backbone of the sport. And again, the very creation of the sport was by a huge Maverick and Bill France Sr. saying, we can do this. We can turn this into a sport. We can build huge speedways. I mean, think about what it must have been like trying to convince people to help finance and then ultimately build Talladega Super Speedway. Obviously, Daytona International Speedway, and then even present day as they continue to in Las Vegas, Kansas, all of these different places. It's really a wonderful story to read, and I think inspiring. I think the Mavericks are inspiring.
Yeah, I'm so excited to read the story about the women in this book and just in general the Mavericks are inspiring. It kind of teaches you to either think differently a little bit or say, you know what? I wanted to go after something. Maybe I should. Did you feel inspired to kind of go after it?
Yeah. Allow yourself to think like that. I wrote a chapter each on Mario Andretti and AJ Foyt, who most people, understandably so, consider open wheel guys, right? I mean, they've both won the Indianapolis 500. Mario obviously won a Formula One title, but you know what? They also both won the Daytona 500. And the fact that they were able to come in the midst of the heyday of their open wheel careers and come in and win the Daytona 500 like that, what more? I mean, that to me is as Maverick as it gets. And I love reading the backstory. It wasn't easy for them. They tried many times and they weren't in the best cars. And definitely the NASCAR drivers, the full-time drivers, they weren't necessarily so hip on an IndyCar guy coming in or an open wheel guy coming in and possibly showing them up. And so to me, I thought that was interesting that not only were they able to do that and persevere, they won.
Yeah, there's so much inspiration that anyone who reads this book, and hopefully everyone does, can take from it. I mean, from the Mavericks, the Trailblazers, everything in between. I am so excited to read this day one. Holly, thank you so much for joining me today on the show. It's been a pleasure getting to learn more about your journey, learning more about this book. And again, thank you just so much.
Thank you for having me, and I wish you all the best. And just know that you definitely have a friend in the media center, so come over and let's talk.
Absolutely. We'll have to catch you next year.
Sounds good. Yes, exactly. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was such an honor getting to talk to Holly today about NASCAR Mavericks, her career, and everything in between. I cannot thank her enough for her time, and continue to support her by following her on social media and getting your copy of NASCAR Mavericks out now. Link in the description below. And for more from us here at Above the Yellow Line, make sure to go to AboveTheYellowLine.com and like this video, subscribe to the channel, share this with your friends and family, and thank you all so much for joining me on this very special episode of Above the Yellow Line. And until next time, I'll see ya. Bye.